Yeah, I'm just curious about how stuff like citations and also preprints and things like that go out, say, through archive.org, where you have this physics preprint location where pretty much anyone who's publishing in physics, they always publicly publish a paper there first, but it hasn't been peer reviewed yet. That's kind of the first exit, and journalists and bloggers and lots of people are going to archive because they're like, oh, hey, there's this cool new paper that's out, and then reporting on it or talking about it as if it's been supported by the rest of the physics community when it actually hasn't.
Well, that's an important point to make, because you know, as a journalist, you've got to decide whether you're going to only report on things which have been peer reviewed, or maybe report from the, conference presentations, or it's kind of a difficult line to tread, isn't it? So and the most important thing is the awareness, I suppose, of whether or not the paper has been peer reviewed, or you to dig into it.
Yeah, and then if you do decide to report on it, how do you present to your reader that this is not peer reviewed, and so you can read this article, but don't really expect this to be true.
Yeah, it has to be high up in the kind of ranking of. It has to be high up in the article that,
It may be a reason why journals like to embargo papers as well.
Yeah.
You don't want those papers out there until a few people have looked at them, even if there is a problem with the process. You want to ensure that they're working quite well. Somebody else had a question.
I just wanted to address that because I think it depends on the field. I mean, in physics, for example, that archive, somebody mentioned before, Nature accepts 10% or rejects 90% of the stuff before they even look at it. In physics, the AIP and the AIP societies publish almost everything. And the part of the scientific process is to post it publicly in the archive, and that's where they get a lot of feedback. And then there's a formal peer review after that. So it really varies discipline to discipline, but I think the important thing for a journalist is to know those variations in a discipline, and that's really hard to do, I think, if you're a very broad-ranged journalist and not in one specific area.
Yeah, you're completely right. Yeah, there's a massive difference between the kind of stories you might write about health and the kind of stories you might write about physics. And the last thing that I want to talk about with citations is that academic scientists rely on citation as for their career progress. It's like a citation ranking is really important. So I don't know whether this is true or not, I'm kind of putting it out there, but there's a possibility that it could be a little bit of self-promotion that they need to do to get their career moving forwards. And so how reliable citation is to know whether it's actually good science or not, that might be slightly muddied. I'm not sure about that. Oh, it's me again. Another thing is reputation. This is, quite a difficult subject because, with scientists, you want to judge their science, not the person themselves, But at the same time, with people like mavericks, outliers on the fringes of the mainstream, you kind of think, well, are they brilliant? Are they sort of visionaries? Or are they actually complete cranks? And how do you tell the difference? I just put two examples up on the slide. And Lynn Margulis wrote a book in the 70s which talked about endosymbiosis, which is a theory that part of our cells comes from bacteria, and this was there was a big outcry about this at the time, and then in the 80s science was embraced, and Dawkins has said he admires her persistence, and so she was a maverick who pushed science forwards, for example, and then there are the other kind of maverick, and really only time can show whether their science or not proves to be true, which, they kind of take an anti-establishment stance. So with Rupert Sheldrake, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's a British non-scientist. No, he masquerades as science. He has this hypothesis of morphic resonance. He wrote a book about that. And the theory is basically about the supernatural. So he takes the gaps in our knowledge and plugs morphic resonance in there, and it's basically about how memory is something that can be inherited and shared, and so he tries to explain things like telepathy with morphic resonance, but it's not good science, or it hasn't been proven, and there are probably other better explanations in the wings waiting to come in.
And our final slide is that the session this morning touched on it, but I think it's quite important, this idea of the new website, Futurity, and it's kind of a new brave new world, and particularly in the UK, when this was launched, there was quite a cry about, you know, the threat to the whole process of journalists, science journalists getting hold of material and working with it and reviewing it and analysing it, investigating it, and now we're going to have the public just taking this research and making whatever they wanted to of it. For me, I think it's really important that the scientists don't speak directly to public. I think scientists should be good communicators of their science, but I think there should be a process where us as science journalists are looking at this stuff, finding out where it's coming from, looking at the stories, and be able to turn it into something that the public can relate to. I think there's an enormous amount of trust, I think, that the public places, particularly in science journalists, of, you know, environment, health, whatever that means. And I think that we need to make sure that we uphold that standard, because it's incredibly important that they can look at, they may want to go on to look at the papers, but that we make sure that they've got comment and they've got a set of people that we can informally go and ask, what do you think about this? And it's kind of a little bit Michael's point last night as well, where you don't just talk to the scientist who's done the work, you go and you find, and you know, it's what I teach my students, you go and you find other people who know about this subject, other people who are very prominent in the field, and then you finally sit there having weighed up and got as much comment and input as you can, and then you as a journalist write what you think is the right thing. Now, I've shown you examples there where I think some of the journalists were at fault as well as the scientists, but I think it's important that journalists keep holding this tradition. And we don't want scientists to do that. We don't want scientists to be running around thinking and balancing things, that we want them to do their research and to be able to communicate it. I know this is controversial, and I'm hoping it's going to provoke some debate, and I can see a hand up already.
I would take issue with that.
Yeah,
as a journalist, well, as a former journalist,
yeah,
who's now a press officer at a university. As a former journalist, I was not a science journalist, but I had to cover science in my stories. And I know there's a lot of times that you do have people with non-science, people who are journalists and who are good journalists, but don't have health or science backgrounds, have to cover these stories. And so they have to speak to the scientists. So the scientists need to know and need to have the skills to interact with both the general public and journalists, just use a broad sense of the word, who may be reporting on their things. If the scientist doesn't have those skills and doesn't know how to adjust the way they present their findings to different audiences, then there's even larger danger of things getting skewed.
And I agree with you. I said that scientists have to be great communicators, and actually 50% of the people who come on my grad course to do their masters are not scientists, and I believe a well-trained student can become a good science journalist even if they don't know. We do that all the time in London, but I do think that when there's got to be a mediation that happens with scientists and the public, and the danger at the moment is that scientists feel that they don't need that mediation. But we can come back to it. Sorry, let me take it.
Yeah, I think with like